So my name is Bobby Conway. I'm the regional manager for Centrify. Not sure if that name rings a bell, but fundamentally our drive and purpose is really to help organizations be able to reduce the threats associated with breaches, particularly cyber threats related to end users and privileged users and their identities that kind of are compromised. So if you ever have a chance, there's some good reading material. I enjoy it. You could probably, the rest of you would probably fall asleep to it, but if you ever look at the breach analyses that happen with Verizon or Mandiant Threat Reports or others that are out there, they kind of analyze the space and fundamentally understand how breaches are actually happening. And so I always like to ask the question, just to kind of gauge and understand who knows more about breaches that are happening today. So I'm always curious, how do you guys think breaches are happening today? Majority. Users do dumb stuff, yes, I'd agree with that. Anything else? So what we typically see is that they are users, right? So when you talk about users, you can kind of classify them as two different groups. One would be a typical end user, another might be a privileged user, right? And all of these users, whether it be dumb stuff, as somebody said, or whether it's inadvertently, being phished, or sharing credentials, and a host of other reasons, the number one cause of breaches today are compromised identities. And so how do you kind of look at that, and how do you analyze that? And fundamentally, when you look across the spectrum, what we see is that organizations are really looking at the divide between end users and privileged users across the enterprise, and looking at it and saying, how do we protect these identities? Because inevitably, there's more and more AAS type of solutions on the market, right? We heard about Office 365. There's more infrastructure like Azure, as well as Google, and platforms that exist. And as you start to grow these, the end users are accessing things through mobile devices, through Macs, that the typical data center is not existent anymore. It's still largely intact, but in a lot of organizations, they're moving to more of that cloud-based infrastructure. And so users are accessing all of these resources in a variety of means, and fundamentally, that's how we see a lot of organizations looking at the center of all of this, which is identity, and being able to manage access to all of the variety of things that people have access to, whether I'm a privileged administrator and trying to get access to our cloud servers or our traditional Unix and Linux servers behind the firewall, or whether I'm an end user trying to do my work within Concur and do my expenses, trying to get access to Office 365 or other popular SaaS applications. Could be that I'm trying to do all of this from my mobile device. And so how do you make sure that that mobile device is secured? How do you make sure that that infrastructure or that cloud application is secured? As well as the identity or what users are doing within all of those environments, whether it's a Unix system, a Windows system, or other within your traditional data center, are kind of governed appropriately. And so that's the mix that we're seeing today more and more of in terms of the risks that ultimately are presented within organizations. So when you look at the breaches that have actually happened, right, and you take a really deep analysis of them, there's some common themes. And some of those common themes really result in things like too many passwords, right? Users are kind of suffering from a variety of fatigue, whether it be passwords for their AAS application or whether it be for some sort of a server or even just getting access to their laptop, right? And so when you have too many passwords, what happens? Users, it's not that they're being malicious, but they tend to cheat. They tend to say, okay, well, I can remember about 6 or 7 complex passwords on a regular basis, right? And that's the average. I'm not saying that some of us are probably above that, but some of us are probably below that, like myself. And so when you start to look at that, you say, okay, well, how are they cheating? Well, they'll use the same password for their Active Directory password, for example, that they remember for their Yahoo, right? Then their personal Yahoo gets breached, and then there can always be a targeted attack towards that corporate identity. That's one small example, right? But when you start to look at the bigger example, people will start to say, well, not only will I use the same password, but I'm also going to start to think about sharing credentials, right? Which is another really bad behavior. Typically, you'll see that if you have your traditional IT outsourcers, right? When you look at these data breach analyses, that's a number one or number two vector as it relates to threats. When you have IT outsourcers that are kind of performing business for your business and doing those IT operations, what's seen in the space is that that's a pretty big risk from a variety of different angles and for a variety of different reasons. But being able to manage that access and who can do what from those traditional IT outsourcers, and you look at the breaches that have happened, right? Target is a popular one that everybody likes to refer to, but there's loads of others when you look at and peel back the onion of how these things happen. But I bet you the next time that you read the paper or you read the Register or other popular security websites, the number one cause and what you'll see underneath it is that it was compromised credentials. How did that actually happen? How did it actually get to compromised credentials? Is probably related to too many passwords, too much privilege, or just basic authentication that's occurring within the enterprise. And I'm pretty sure of that, right? So how do you move from more of a risky, I don't like the word danger, right? But I prefer the term risky, right? It doesn't mean that tomorrow, if any of these things are happening within your organization, that you're going to get breached. But inevitably, you can start to look at this and say, there's some risky behavior happening here, right? Because the second thing is really around too much privilege. So when you have people logging in and doing their administrator work every day as a powerful shared account, like a local administrator, a root, an Oracle, or other types of very powerful shared accounts, that's too much privilege. Time and time again, we're seeing that organizations are saying to themselves, well, hold on a second, we're managing the password for those privileged accounts. So don't we get any credit for that? Absolutely. That's part of the risk that ultimately organizations are challenged with. But the larger part of the risk is that there's too much privilege to begin with. A junior Windows admin probably shouldn't have the rights to have domain administrators rights or local administrator rights on all of the systems, right? But rather, why not have them log in, be able to give them the appropriate amount of privilege that matches their job function? That is a concept of least privilege, right? And so fundamentally, we see that organizations are not doing that for whatever reason. It could be cost, it could be complexity, it could be a combination of that, as well as they're just not ready, right? But inevitably, there's too much happening within organizations, and it's a fundamental theme that we see across a lot of organizations that we interact with who are trying to address that across the board. And then finally, the final thing is basic authentication. Shop is open 24/7. You can think of it as 7-Eleven. All I need is a password in order to get into that, right? That could be a lot of different things. That could be your Hadoop environment, which is a very data-rich environment. It could be all of the systems on the back end. It could be applications that hold very sensitive information. More and more popular HR applications are moving to the cloud. So you get the point that when you look at it and there's just basic authentication occurring, it's no longer enough, right? I want to be very clear with that. It's no longer enough to have passwords protecting access to those critical resources, right? Because inevitably, these are how these breaches are happening. And if you don't have things like MFA and other important components kind of protecting that identity and protecting access to those critical resources, it's a risky behavior. So in general, we'll start to move down, right? You get to good and better and best and optimal and all of that. But as you can kind of guess, these are the things that Centrify is synonymous with. These are the things that we help customers with across being able to protect from an end user perspective, a privileged user perspective, and protecting the organization against modern cyber threats. One of those things is being able to consolidate identities. Being able to take all of these cloud applications that exist throughout the enterprise and all of those usernames and passwords, and fundamentally being able to join them into a common infrastructure that you already have, which is typically Active Directory. Or taking Unix and Linux systems, being able to say, well, hey, we've got local accounts within all of those systems. We want to be able to consolidate all of those identities into something like Active Directory. Very common, very popular thing that we're seeing. The other thing that we're doing is MFA everywhere. Access to applications, access to systems, to VPNs, and to many other resources is really the theme of our entire organization, is being able to introduce MFA everywhere as opposed to that open 24/7, 7-Eleven type of methodology that says I've got a password, give me access. But now it's I've got a password and I want to be able to use a soft token like a mobile device to get access to those varieties of resources. As you move down, you start to look at better, being able to do single sign-on provisioning, getting access and giving access to the appropriate applications and areas of business that organizations need to get access to. But here's another one, the contextual awareness of being able to give the appropriate access to individuals based on context, right? So no longer is it more of the 7-Eleven open 24/7 and having just a password. I'm multi-factoring, but also I'm introducing context. Being able to say things like, hold on a second, Jim's trying to get access to this critical application or to the server or to some other resource within our enterprise. It's 2 in the morning and his IP address is coming from some other country, right? That's typically a risky type of thing. So let's apply some context to that and say, you know what, that doesn't make me feel comfortable. You can't get access. It's in our maintenance window or whatever the context might be. We have the ability to introduce that into the enterprise and be able to restrict access based on context. Some different variables that you can kind of define, whether it's access and time, location of that particular mobile device, and quite a few other contexts. As you move on, you start to get into more of an optimal of being able to introduce least privilege, as well as being able to audit what individuals have done across the enterprise, as well as being able to solve the conundrum of infrastructure as a service, as well as outsourced IT. More and more organizations are using IT outsourcers to perform a lot of functions. And as I mentioned, that is a major, major risk when you look at all of the breaches that have happened. And fundamentally, we help to address that, not just for your internal resources, but also your external sources. So when we talk about this, right, when we talk about least privilege in general, you can start to think of it, and I want to kind of just give you a scenario of Tony, right? Tony's logging into a web server, that's his job function. You can kind of see it's a heartbeat, right? He's strumming along his day. All of a sudden, he needs to do some changes on the web server itself, right? Make some configurations. That's going to require some elevated privilege. In today's world, Tony might do something like, I'm going to log in with my SA account, right, on Windows, or I'm going to SU to root on a Unix and Linux system, right? We've talked about that, how that's not a good thing, because that would give Tony way more privilege than what he really needs. What he really needs is to be able to have the ability to restart that web server. So why not just define that and be able to say, hey, I'm going to give Tony the ability to restart that web server as part of this role. And so that's a very different conversation than just giving him carte blanche. And so that's what's happening here. But in addition, when he did that, he got an MFA on his watch or in his phone that said, hey, is this really Tony? Did you mean to do that? And we used some context around, hey, is Tony inside the network trying to do this? Is it the right time of day? Is it inside of our change window that he can do this kind of stuff? And then he goes back down and he's able to back up files and do other specific things related to his job function. As opposed to, Tony logs in at the beginning of the day, he changes his identity to an SA account or some other highly powerful account, does that the entire day, and then he goes home. It's a very different story. And how malware is getting into organizations today is how Tony, in the previous world, was really kind of dictating his day, right? When malware, whatever Tony can do, that malware can do. And so because Tony's elevating that process, he's not changing his core identity and getting too much privilege to begin with. It's a very different story as opposed to what was happening in the previous world. So you can imagine some of all the things that we're talking about here is what Centrify is synonymous with, right? So when you look at the entire spectrum of what Centrify does, we really focus on being able to provide secure access to infrastructure, as well as applications. So things like your systems, your network devices, your applications that reside internally or applications that reside in the cloud, for even things like big data, right? Big data is coming along. A lot of Hortonworks or Hadoop environments, Cloudera, MapR, NoSQL is becoming into play. That's even more of a compounded discussion that you need to have because it's a very data-rich environment. You have to protect access to that, right? I could just say, you know what, I'm just going to give carte blanche access to that environment too, but it's even a bigger problem because that data-rich environment that exists. So it's also around any device. So being able to give access to those individuals that need to get access from those variety of devices. So there's a plethora of flavors of Droid and iOS and lots more that are flooding the market. And being able to provide that efficiency and ability for organizations to give their employees access to the things they need to get access to from mobile devices, you have to think through, how do I secure that device, right? How do I secure access so that the individual themselves are being able to get access to the things that they need to get access to, but making sure that the core data itself is protected because that device itself is protected, right? So you've heard of enterprise mobility management, mobile device management, content management, mobile application management. All of those things are things that we're synonymous with as well. And then for all users. So you could start to think through that you've got a larger community and ecosystem beyond just your internal users sometimes that need to get access to critical applications and other resources, your third-party outsourcers or others. And of course, your internal employees that need to be more efficient and be able to get access to the things that they need to get access to. So when you combine all of this, Centrify is really at the core of it. There's a myriad of different types of combinations here, right? It could be a scenario where somebody says, hey, I need to get access to a system, and I need to make sure that the individual, that we're adhering to least privilege and that we're kind of making sure that all of the activity is audited across all of those environments. That's one use case that we help out with. Another use case would be that, hey, I've got a large amount of applications that we're using and we're consuming as an organization, right? We're bringing on Concur and Workday and Office 365 and a host of other usernames and passwords applications throughout our organization. We help with SAML and other types of token-based authentication, be able to tie that into Active Directory. There's more examples, and you can go onto our website to see the spaces that we're involved with, but fundamentally we're involved with privileged access management, identity as a service, enterprise mobility management, and quite a bit more. So these are the three kind of pillars of our platform, from going from the left to the right. First is identity service, so it's synonymous with things like B2C and B2B. So federation is a very popular topic nowadays. MFA, as we've talked about, multi-factor authentication, being able to provision into those web-based or SaaS-based applications, enterprise mobility management, and even Macs. It's a very popular topic, right? More and more Macs are coming into the enterprise. Well, guess what? You've just introduced new identity, and you've introduced a new endpoint into the equation. How do you manage that? What we often hear is that's kind of the black sheep of the family, and it's kind of just out there. Whenever I ask, well, how are you managing those? Well, I don't know. I don't remember. Or I don't care, right? But inevitably, you have to think of that as another critical point within the enterprise. And so we have the ability to manage those Macs securely, time in Active Directory, push group policy out to them, and quite a few other things. In the middle, it's around privileged service. So how many are familiar with the term like a password vault or password safe? That would be synonymous with this. So checking in a critical password for those shared accounts that need to be maintained on a regular basis, being able to introduce multi-factor authentication, doing things like application-to-application password management, where you have hard-coded passwords within applications that need to be rotated on a regular basis. And then being able to give secure remote access to those environments from any device and all the other things that we've talked about. And then finally, the server suite is really around least privilege. So being able to introduce a least privilege principle throughout the organization and being able to say that Tony can log in as himself, he stays himself, but he's given just enough privilege to do his job. And in addition, I want to be able to audit or be able to determine what Tony has done throughout that entire session, because we've got auditors knocking on our door that are saying, hey, I want to know all of the people that have logged in with privilege, and I want to know what they did. And so that's what Centrify is good at as well, is being able to introduce that least privilege principle across the environment, including doing things like AD bridging and joining those Unix and Linux systems into Active Directory. So lots of customers. I'm happy to go through this. You can go to our website. You can see all of our customers as well. 50% of the Fortune 50 are using our solutions, and quite a bit more. We have over 5,000 customers. We've been in business for about 12 years. We're headquartered in Santa Clara, California, one of those prototypical, very smart security organizations. And so fundamentally, we're happy to give you some better exposure to that if you had any questions. But that's it for me, and we definitely appreciate you guys coming out today. And my name is Bobby, and if there's any questions that you have afterwards, please come by. Happy to answer. Thank you.